Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Brett, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We are here with John Vervaeke. John, thanks for being here again.
Always a pleasure.
And so we'll get right to the questions. So KRP asked from last time, what do you think about meaning wave as a psychotechnology?
Yeah, I don't know it very much. I only have a connection to it through Akira the Dawn, and so I might be biased. I found what he does really, really cool. So first of all, I'm just going to have my sort of a bit of a nerd response, which is the particular song he did for me, or not for me, but about me, I guess, or my about my work. That's the better way of putting it. Steal the culture. I really just like it as a piece of art, and so I think the possibility. I've seen that other people have been doing that. Of course, Akira's done it to other people's work, like he's done it with Jordan Peterson's work and Alan Watts' work. I've seen other people doing similar things. I've seen some of the videos doing it with some of my work about soul flight and other things. I think it's excellent. I think it is an artistic form that is resisting the general trend that has been observed by musicologists about the progressive impoverishment of music in popular culture. What this means on average is we see a shrinkage of melody. Melody has been disappearing in favor of shorter and shorter sound bites, and bursts, and chords. And lyrics have been also degrading in terms of complex imagery and being replaced by something much more like sheer repetition. This is sort of irrespective of particular musicians and genres. And I'm not, of course, there are notable exceptions to everything I just said. So when musicologists are talking about this, they're talking about general trends on average. And meaning wave represents a somewhat, maybe even deliberate, at least clearly explicit reversal of that process. You're trying to get much more complex melody going, integrated with very complex lyrical development, often almost argumentative thought, and restoring some of the complexity that song used to have for us. Um, I think this bodes well uh, because such a medium can actually convey much more complexity of meaning, which is needed right now to deal with the complexity of the environment. And just as so that's the content, and just in terms of its form, that complexity in and of itself, that dynamic complexity, is probably good for helping cultivate what John Rusin calls the musicality of intelligibility. And so I think overall, um, again, let me put in my caveat. I'm largely ignorant. I'm only familiar with some specific cases. Maybe they are exemplary. I don't know. But given that caveat, which is an important one, I would say that I give anyway, anyway that positive evaluation I've just given it.
And also, you just mentioned steal the culture. I was wondering if you could tell people what you mean by that.
By the phrase or by the piece of work by Akira the Don? Which
No,
one do you
by
mean?
by the phrase steal the culture.
Oh, by the phrase steal the culture. So, um, well, I sometimes start it by quoting a piece of popular music from my when I was growing up, which is from the Police, "Spirits in the Material World," and it's there is no political solution to our troubled evolution. And the idea behind "Steal the Culture" is any attempt to try and respond to the meaning crisis through something like a political revolution, a renovation, or some sort of new kind of socioeconomic policy is probably doomed to fail, given how deeply interwoven both of those systems have become with the meaning crisis. A lot more argument there I could put into that discussion. I'm just going to take that as at least a plausible idea that people will trust can be backed up with a lot more argument and evidence. And the idea then that instead we need to do something like what Christianity did within the Roman Empire. It did not attempt to overthrow the political regime. It did not invent new socioeconomic policy or change the legal code. until much later, until it had done something else. What it had done is it had built new communities of practices, integrating those new communities of practice with homes and then communities of homes. And these gatherings, these ecclesias, where we get our word ecclesiastical in church, of course, network together to create a new counterculture that was, of course, eventually recognized by the Roman Empire as a threat to the cultural foundations of the empire. And then what happened is Christianity eventually won that battle, that cultural battle, even though the Roman Empire had all the political, economic, and military machinery at its disposal to try and crush um, the emergent new culture. Now, what's fascinating about that, I mean, of course, Christians would say that was because Christianity is true, and they, of course, have the right to advance that argument. I think we have similar cases in different parts of history that are not dependent on the particular truths of Christian dogma. So I'm interested in what are the what are the processes within distributed cognition that make such a transformation bottom up, uh, what makes such a cultural revolution analogous to the Axial revolution possible. I often say to people, I don't believe in anything like the French or Russian revolutions or even American revolution will give us what we need right now. I'm looking for something much more like the Axial revolution or the revolution that happened after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And we got the birth of a new kind of civilization that we call medieval. And I'm proposing that this community here, for example, the Discord server is one of many such communities that are analogous to the home ecclesias, the home gatherings of the incipient, right? Incipient, not insipid, incipient um, Christian church, which was not just what we think of as church. It was a new way of being, a new way of seeing, a new way of being a person, a new way of being a person in communities that had been created and that made new civilization possible. And I think we are at the stage, this is of course controversial, but many people would also agree with me. We're at a stage where we're facing something analogous to the Axial Revolution. We're at the stage where we're looking for a need to change civilization, not just a political state or system of political governance or socioeconomic policy.
Great. Thank you for that. Andre, can you read the next question?
The next question is from Eric S. I just want to make a quick note as well to say that our good friend Paul Vanderklay is in the audience right now.
Paul!
And so Eric asks, familiar with the work of Dr. Ben Goertzel, brackets AI researcher, and specifically his work towards AGI, brackets, whom seems to be using a line of thinking similar to your economic model of relevance realization.
I've heard the name, but I have to confess ignorance of his work. Um, I would be pleased if both of these things were true. That I'm ignorant of his work and it's convergent with mine, because that would be very good evidence for a plausibility argument for the proposals that I'm making. If he independently has converged on something very similar from within his work on AGI. It's someone's work I need to know more about. But I guess right now I'm kind of happy that I'm ignorant of it because of the possibility that a convergence argument is now available to me. So I'd like to get that name. Perhaps somebody could email it to me afterwards, and I'd like to track this down. I believe I've heard of this person. I believe in one of the books I've got on AGI, but I'm not familiar with their work specifically or in any kind of depth.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Todd Felt. Has anyone doing serious research on the Meaning Project noticed or investigated how many of the boxes are checked by participating in a serious improv acting group? Flow, mindfulness, gnosis, communitas, and many more are naturally integral parts of the practice as part of the ensemble, though not as explicitly. Maybe this has been already mapped out in the literature.
So every year, and I mean this as a compliment, not to be dismissive, every year I get some students who do some papers for my courses on the relationship between improv and some of the other practices I talk about. I've got some literature on it. I've been reading up on it. I think it's important that we bring some kind of improv or some kind of integration of improv and something like Jeep form into the ecology of practices. And I totally agree with everything that's said about improv. Improv is basically sort of, if you'll allow me a metaphor, it's dramatic jazz. It's jazzing, it's jazz, but where you're not jazzing with with musical notes. You're jazzing with little bits of drama, tropes of roles and perspective. And this is very powerful. And as we know from the research that has been done on something very similar, which is Jeep form and LARPing, especially Jeep form, because Jeep form uses the DM as the director to introduce a huge improv element. This form is taking off, especially in. I just wrote about this in a book chapter that's going to be published in the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Meditation, about Jeep form and things like this. How this form, and I've talked about it in some of my videos, is sort of taking over in Scandinavian countries, the countries that sort of pride themselves on being, the most secular and the most non-religious. They, of course, also wrestle with other issues in an important way. I won't get into that in detail, but it's interesting that these kinds of improv ritualized drama that are supposed to bring about the phenomena of bleed. Bleed is when what you're doing in the drama and what you're doing in real life, the line between them blurs, so that you start to lose the distinction, not in any psychotic way, but in a helpful way. You start to lose, am I just playing here, or is this more like what I call serious play, or am I starting to enact some of the problems in my real life, or is this drama that I'm improving on giving me sort of the Solomon effect, or the problems that I'm locked into from my first person perspective within my real life? And I do not mean this in any disrespect, but I think that phenomena of bleed is very analogous into what non-secular religious contexts are attempting to do. I mean, at least one of the functions, and I mean, this was even explicitly told to me when I used to attend churches, you're supposed to go through things at church, in which you're kind of doing role playing and other things, and you're singing songs and you're reading scripture. Sometimes you're even doing some drama. You're enacting a ritual, but it's supposed to bleed into your life, and your life is supposed to bleed into what's happening in church in some kind of mutually transformative fashion. And so I think that this is a long answer, but it's towards a very important issue. One of the things we're doing with all of this family of things and other families of serious play practices is we're hungry for these rituals of transformation that function powerfully to give us transformation. And improv properly I would argue, properly belongs in that family. And you can think of elements of improv even within Christian denominations. I had an aunt and uncle who were Pentecostal, and there was a huge element of, and I mean this respectfully, this huge element of improv in what was going on there. And like me, brought up in a very staid sort of Baptist thing, that was like, it almost freaked me out as a kid. It's like, what are these people doing? They're not following the script and things like that. And there's a lot of improv in a lot of Taoist practices. And even in the this is emphasized in the sacred literature. So I think improv and how it fits into this larger family of practices, the reason why people are doing research on it, the reason why people are proposing it, as has been done here, the reason why it's growing, especially in countries that pride themselves, I think, a little bit self-deceptively on being so secular, is precisely because they are addressing a function that used to be properly addressed by the existing religious institution. And here I'm making a Jungian critique, and many of you are familiar with it. And I remind you again that I don't think Jung was a Christian apologist. Here's where I differ with my colleague Jordan Peterson. But Jung basically said if the religions were doing his job, he would be out of a job. And so that's actually a critique. And I think I'm in alignment, at least with that aspect. I think the reason why improv is so powerfully growing, like again, both in terms of its cultural presence and its academic prestige, is precisely because it is starting to fill that gap that has not been filled properly in quite some time.
Next, we've got a question from Sally Joe, and it's, is being explicitly good in itself?
That's a question that you either give like a one sentence answer or you talk for 7 hours. So I would say on the basis of a lot of reading and rereading and reflecting and reading it as Lectio Divina, being transformed and entering into dialogos about it, dialectic into dialogos, the Platonic literature, even the Christian Platonic literature. The answer I think is yes. To try and give a little bit without going into 7 hours is when we say being, we mean something that is somehow the simultaneous source without itself being divided of how things are integratable, how they can become one. I think a thing is something only exists as a thing to the degree to which it is one, and that means it has a for itselfness. That means it exists for itself. Spinoza would call it its conatus. Everything to the degree to which it is not just an aggregate or a pile holds itself together in some powerful way. It is for itself. And when we reach into ourselves, into the honest depths of our psyche, we have this realization of our for itselfness of ourself as somehow fundamentally good. Now we can of course warp and twist that, and we can think of narcissism and pride. But, to my mind, the religions never say that in and of itself is evil. I don't think that should ever be attributed to Christianity. That for it, because God pronounces that everything is good, including human beings, right? That when I see into myself that for itselfness, that the way I'm one and I'm autopoetic, I'm for myself, but that for itselfness that I have, that I find just intrinsically valuable, just because I'm constituted by that for itselfness. That's what makes me be what I am. It makes everything possible to me. Everything it makes me intelligible to myself. It makes the degree to which I can be one and integrated makes me intelligible to others. And I compare that, if you want to call it love of myself, to the way everything is for itself. How could I possibly say that my for itself is somehow intrinsically good, but the for itselfness of the rock or the mountain or the river is not itself also intrinsically good? What possible argument could I bring to bear that would justify me privileging this for itselfness, and I'm pointing at my chest right now, versus any other for itselfness, and even more so, my for itselfness and the rock's for itselfness, its intelligibility, its oneness, its for itselfness, all of these are dependent on the ultimate source of all wanting for itselfness. And that must be good, because if my in itselfness is good, and I recognize that it's derivative from that pure in itselfness, pure oneness, realness, or source of intelligibility, then that must even more so be intrinsically good. And I take what I'm now pointing to be the ground of being. That's what I would say when I say that the ground of being is intrinsically good. We recognize this. Keep pointing this out. We treat truth unquestionably as intrinsically good, When all we're measuring by truth is not whether or not we like something, we're just measuring how real it is, how intelligible it is, how much for itselfness it has, how much it hangs together for itself. And we want truth for its own sake because I would argue that is our direct phenomenological acknowledgement that being is fundamentally good. This is not moral goodness or aesthetic goodness or epistemic goodness. It is the goodness that makes all of those other ones derivatively possible.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is from Yosef. Hi, John. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I've really enjoyed engaging with your thought. Are schema mental models fully resolvable into the 4 Ps? I have seen some in CogSci say that schema can be decomposed as propositional and procedural knowledge. However, mental models seem to also encode semiotic and non-logical identity relations, relating to concepts narratively or through metaphor. Is this a 5th P, like parabolic as suggested by some folk on the server, or are schema really fully decomposable into the other 4 Ps? Best, Yosef.
Okay, so that's a great question, first of all. And part of the problem with answering it is the word that's being invoked, schema, which really comes into prominent intellectual discourse with Kant, is used in about 17,000 different ways within psychology. Schema is one of the words that it suffers from what's called in psychology the jingle jangle problem. The jingle jangle problem in psychology is, I can never remember which is jingle and which is jangle. Igor Grossman will get mad at me for forgetting because there's an irony in there. But one of the errors is psychology will often name the same phenomena with multiple different names. It just confuses people and confuses research and makes it difficult to make claims and make inferences just because the same phenomena is given different names. The other mistake is when different phenomena are given the same name. And I would say to you that both of these happen with the word schema in really, really annoying ways. One of the great questions to ask somebody who invokes a schema is, what is the process by which the schema is formed? And they'll either say something useless like schematization, or they'll say, I don't know. You know that the concept is actually ultimately being deployed in a dodgy manner. Insofar as we can coordinate it, because I think there is a difference between, for example, a feature list and a feature schema. What we can do is, this is what I have explicitly proposed how we should use the word schema. We should use the word schema to capture that feature lists are not adequate representing our understanding. The feature lists do not tell us the relationship between the features. This is my typical example of a bird isn't just wings, feathers, etc., but the structural functional organization. Schema is exactly different from a feature list in that what it does is it attempts to answer causal questions. What are the causal relations between the features, or what are the part-whole relations between the features? A schema is the result of answering those questions such that we can map out a structural functional organization by answering the causal and the part-whole questions. Now, I want to stipulate that that's how I'm going to answer the question, because that is my published attempt to try and stabilize the meaning of schema in a way that connects it with the philosophical literature and I think can be usefully employed within the psychological literature. Given that, I think our schemas have to do with organizing the feature list of our memory, of our kinds of memory. What kinds of memory do we have? We have semantic memory. This is our knowledge that. This is our propositional knowing. We have episodic memory. This is a memory of episodes. This is our perspectival knowing. We have procedural memory, which is memory for skills, procedures. And lastly, we have that weird form of memory we call the self, often called autonoetic memory and various things. And this is participatory knowing. Insofar as we can map out the relations between these kinds of memory, which is what we're always doing when we're talking about how we're organizing the information in our heads, I think you could properly argue that all schemas are answers about relations, causal and part-whole relations between propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory knowing. Now, the question arises, are those relations themselves a new kind of knowing? Don't, like I said, I've entertained this proposal 2 or 3 times, and the problem I have with it is you need to give me some kind of memory, some kind of vehicle. I won't repeat all the arguments. There's a difficulty in making a fifth P, giving it a proper locus within processing, within kinds of memory, within the kinds of normative structures we have. We know what the norms are for propositional knowing. We know what, truth, evaluability. What is it for skills? It's power. What is it for perspective? It's presence. What is it for participatory knowing? It's that sense of identity, of belonging that goes with our sense of self and the world having a kind of home for that self, agent arena relationship. And that is what I've not been able to see in these proposals. I'm not saying people should stop making these proposals. What authority would I have to say that? But and also people are free to propose other kinds of taxonomies. Spinoza has a different a taxonomy of kinds of knowing. He talks about imagination, knowledge that's based on imagination, knowledge that's based on reasoning, and knowledge that's based on scientia intuitiva. And that's a sort of normative hierarchy. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do right now, I'm doing a lot of work on Spinoza, is integrate the 4 Ps of knowing with these sort of 3 levels at which we are capable of knowing. That's a tricky thing to do, but I think there's value in it because Spinoza picks up on a pattern that is found going all the way back to Plato about not only about seeing a kind of normative hierarchy between kinds of knowing. So that's something that I'm giving my thought to right now. I don't know if schemas would satisfy any of the criteria that I'm asking for. I don't see how they can, because I think all kinds of knowings involve these relational organizational structures. You don't want to say something like there's a new kind of knowing, which is to find a structural functional organization to information, because that's what all knowing is, and that would be a category mistake. We need to get something specific about it. Now, again, other people have said, but aren't there things that happen between the interactions between them, like this schema? I think that's right. I think that's right, that there are very much causal and part-whole interactions between the kinds of knowing. And like I said, mapping that out is probably going to require something like the normative hierarchy to tell whether or not, when we're putting things together well and when we're putting things together poorly. That's the best answer I can give to that right now.
Next question is going to be from
My name's hard to say. It's Maroxy Bind. It's a chess opening. Hi, John. It's
Go ahead.
Hi, John. It's good to hear from you. I hope that everything's been going well in terms of your health and also your well-being.
My health has been pretty good in terms with my ear. In
Yes.
my morning practices, I actually hurt my hip. So it's been causing me some pain, but it seems to be getting better. So thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Yes, that is great to hear. Not about your hip, but about that. You're doing okay. So
The person that we should keep in our thoughts is my good friend and coworker Amar. He's been suffering from also an ear issue, giving him a tremendous amount of vertigo for the past 4.5 months, 5 months. That's why he hasn't been able to do a lot of the work on my network that he normally does. Unfortunately, we're sort of having to find a replacement for him, but my thoughts go out to him right now. And I really understand what he's going through because I suffer from something similar to it. One thing going for him is what he has will actually go away with time as opposed to what I have. Hopefully with time he'll feel better.
that is great to hear on his part. I hope that he can find some level of peace, currently right now for him. But but yes, thank you. So my question for you is, what makes insight dissociable from intelligibility, as well as intelligence? Furthermore, is there a connection between insight and the unintelligible? And I'll give you, to give some context on my question, I'll quickly mention a situation that Hubert Dreyfus describes in one of his Heidegger lectures. So he describes, imagine yourself walking to the fridge and you're going to pull out a carton of orange juice, and instead you grab a milk carton and you then drink it expecting it to be our orange juice. But really what happens is that you kind of, you taste the milk and you don't know how to interpret it. You don't know how to process it. What happens is that you kind of fail to take a stand on your situation for just a split little second until you're then able to then say, oh, it must have been that I pulled the orange juice carton. So my question here is that in that split moment, you find yourself in a kind of unintelligibility. So I'd therefore like to know if this kind of breakdown of your stand taking is what sort of can enable insight. That's my question.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent question. So let's answer the preliminary question behind it, and then I'll address it directly. These moments of disruption, intelligence and insight. So what I would say is right now, the psychometrics by which we measure intelligence are good predictors of insight, and therefore standard measures of intelligence therefore don't predict insight just because of the psychometric measures we're using. However, Sternberg has work showing that if you take those standard measures of general intelligence and also get people to run a bunch of insight problems and then put the two together, that combined psychometric is a better predictor than just measures of G alone. And for me, and there's related work also about the relationship between intelligence and rationality, but I won't get into that. For me, what that points to, and this is what Leo Ferraro and I have argued, is that the core of general intelligence is relevance realization. That what we're measuring when we're measuring intelligence, for example, is we're measuring the higher order relevance realization that's going on in working memory. So what working memory does is take information that's been pre-processed unconsciously for relevance, and it does sort of a final pass on it, a final filtering. At least that's what I think the work that's being done at University of Toronto by Lynn Hasher shows that's what working memory is about. And measures of working memory are highly correlated with measures of G. Okay, there's a much bigger argument there, and I give it in published work and Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and other videos. Let's just take it as plausible that what we're talking about with intelligence is relevance realization, especially when that gets integrated with predictive processing models, etc. Again, I won't go into the details. I think, therefore, if you reinterpret intelligence as relevance realization, and I can make a good argument because I made it in print, that's what Spearman was originally talking about when he talked about general intelligence, then you can see a continuity between intelligence and insight, because insight is just an instance of that higher order recursive relevance realization. It's relevance realization correcting itself, which is intrinsic to the nature of relevance realization as this evolving process of cognitive fittedness. So we can draw a direct continuity between intelligence and insight, and that would ultimately justify and explain why putting the two measures together is a better predictor than just the measure of intelligence alone. Now, if that's the case, what we should ask is there something central to intelligence and insight, and insofar as they disclose intelligibility from the world, that is properly disruptive, like you just said? And I think the argument I would make is very much so. In fact, this is the evidence on this is pretty important. You look, for example, take the biological version of evolution, and of course, disruptive events are terrifically important to affording speciation, and affording what's been called punctuated equilibrium. If you take a look within the insight solving problem literature, disruptive strategies, frame breaking strategies, mild amounts of distraction, even the inborn switching between the task focus network and the default mode network, all of these things help break up, right, the framing. So introducing variation so that so the selection can cause your framing of situations to evolve. For me, this also lines up with all the work done by L.A. Paul and Agnes Callart about how a lot of our cognitive abilities is inherently developmental. We're going through these transformations that are not just incremental or linear, but are non-linear in an important way. And what all of this is saying is we have to extend our understanding of rationality. If what we mean by rationality is the ability to overcome self-deception so that we can make good sense, so that we can flourish in our individual and community lives, we have to broaden the notion of rationality in such a way in which these disruptive strategies and the transformations that they afford find a proper place in our theorizing. And our logic-centric Cartesian model of purely inferential understanding of rationality is completely inadequate for addressing this. If you think about it, at the core of axial age spirituality was the prospect of self-transcendence. And self-transcendence is exactly this kind of nonlinear, discontinuous transformation in which increased wisdom, meaning making, zeroing in on what's really important and relevant is occurring. And so I would argue that that moment at the fridge that Dreyfus talks about, and Dreyfus is great for finding these little examples that portend much more ideas, right? That, and Rusin does the same thing. Rusin is brilliant. Read Bearing Witness to Epiphany. Really read it.
Sorry, Bearing Witness to an Epiphany?
Bearing Witness to Epiphany by John Rusin, Russon. He's also got a new book out on the Republic called Politics, Money, and Persuasion. John Rusin is actually coming to the University of Toronto in the next term to speak at a CogSci conference. That moment where you are between the orange juice and the milk, right? Isn't that an amazing moment? Right? That's the moment when you're in between frames and you come close to almost purely participating in the framing process for its own sake. And I think what Plato argues, and I don't know if Dreyfus argues this, but Rusin certainly does, is we can expand and deepen that moment. And that's what wonder is. Not curiosity, but that's what wonder is, and why wonder is so central to wisdom, because wonder is that kind of profound disruption that can afford profound transformation and profound cultivation of wisdom.
Thank you so much for your phrase there, that we can expand and deepen that moment. That's very poetic and helpful.
Well, thank you. And like I say, I think the continuity between intelligibility, intelligence, insight, wonder, flow. This is something that I've been working very hard on, the cognitive continuum, and then realizing that there's a continuum in reality, depths or levels of reality that are disclosed along this continuum. That's something that's at the core of what I'm arguing right now.
Great. Struan, you have a question for John.
Hi, John.
Hey, Struan, good to hear from you.
Good to hear you as well. I want to riff off of what Vervaeke said to you last time about kinds of knowledge being nested inside each other. But before I do that, I think I need to make one move just to anchor the frame, otherwise it's not going to land. So the move I want to make is, on a phenomenological level, I think there's a large amount of overlap between the material cause and propositional knowing. And my argument in favor of that is that from an evolutionary standpoint, it looks like the language centers of our brain appear to be an exaptation of the fine motor control areas of our brain, right? The parts that control our hand. So if the hand is an external matter manipulator, then it's like language is the internal matter manipulator. Does that follow?
Let me think. Why would you map? This is an open question. Why would you map it onto material cause rather than efficient cause? Because isn't the hand sort of tracing out causal pathways and causal connections by its manipulation?
Sometimes, but there is just the experience of the matter itself. I think is going to have more of a well, you take matter in your hands basically, and so your experience with it is hands on. And I don't know, maybe that is too much of a reach, but I do.
Oh,
At least in a
I just point
phenomenological.
out that when you're doing that, you're moving matter out of like classical definition within the four causes, right? The material cause in that way. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, as I said, it's phenomenological, right?
Okay.
Um, so I do think that that the kinds of knowledge can nest within one another, but I think that there are also going to be personalities associated with those nestings. So specifically, um, the propositional within the perspectival, for example, is going to be orderliness, and then the propositional within the perspectival is going to be intellect. I didn't confuse those two. I mean, I didn't repeat myself, did I?
No, you said order. Do you mean by orderliness conscientiousness, or
Yes.
are
Within
you?
so
Yeah, the big
you
five. You're
see,
using the big
well,
five. Yeah.
yeah. I explicitly think that the big five mappings, the personality mappings, and the four Ps actually line up with one another. And so
That's really
the reason that I
interesting.
was making the reason that I was making the overlap between propositional knowing and the material cause is because precisely orderliness is about always placing matter in the right place. And
Hmm.
but it's not propositional in that sense, but it is propositional, I think, on a phenomenological level, because there's that. I just think there's an overlap of the instinct.
Okay. Well, can I interject here? Because that's a
Yeah.
little bit different. You should know, by the way, I just got a paper published in Phenomenology and Cognitive Science,
Yeah.
integrating relevance realization theory and the big five together, with Colin DeYoung's
Yeah.
work, Gary Hovnanian and I. The standard interpretation of conscientiousness is the ability to pursue long-term goals, and that sounds more like final causation to me. That's the standard sort of psychological interpretation of conscientiousness. A conscientious person is a
Well,
person who can pursue long-term goals.
yeah, and I know that. Well, I think that you make that with industriousness, if I remember correctly, more specifically than conscientiousness. And what I would say to you
Yeah.
actually agree with that slightly, because I think that industriousness is actually the procedural within the propositional. And so there
That's
is that
interesting.
the yeah, and then well, if you want to reverse that, the
So
propositional
what's
within the
openness?
procedural would be assertiveness. Sorry.
What's openness? What's openness?
Well, openness would basically be the perspectival, and then so intellect is a facet of openness, and so the propositional within the perspectival would be
Oh, I
intellect.
see what you're doing. Oh, you should write that out. Are you
Yeah.
ready?
So well, I've got the whole. Well, there's 12 of them, 12 combinations. I've got all 12 basically sorted out, and that you called it. I think it was a medicine wheel. I could forget who you were talking to, but the native
Oh yeah, I
Americans have
remember. I
like a
remember. Yeah. What's his
yeah
name? The Tribal Edge. I can't. Is it Ben? I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. Oh,
yeah
I
me neither.
apologize.
But I
That's
think
very
there's basically
interesting.
a similar pattern. Yeah, and
I'd
so
like to see that. I'd like to see that.
okay, well I'll get it to you. But I just also wanted to say that I know that you referred to the combination of the big five and predictive processing and relevance realization as some kind of maniacal dream. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a foregone conclusion. It's only a matter of when, not if. And yeah, I
Well,
might be the only person more impatient than you to see it come to fruition.
well, I mean, what happened? I mean, we've got the relevance realization and the big five published. Harry and I are working on integrating relevance realization and attachment theory, and then we're going to do some work with Greg Enriquez about that. And then Brett and Mark and I are finishing up integrating relevance realization and predictive processing. So I'm very much trying to bring them all together, but I hadn't done anything mapping. The place where I talk about the relationship between the kinds of knowings is in the work I do on consciousness. Your point is well taken because, of course, I argue that consciousness is a function of recursive relevance realization and is continuous within fluid intelligence and working memory, which there's lots of converging evidence for that. Because I think of consciousness as our participatory knowing of and through perspectival knowing of our procedural abilities. I don't put propositional into consciousness because I'm worried about that would limit consciousness just to sort of language using beings, and I reject that proposal. But yeah, that's very cool. Please send me that, Struan. I look at everything you send me. I can't reply to it all, but I would really like to take a look at what you're saying.
Okay, yeah, I'll work on that. I definitely think like the stability and plasticity that you're working on that's the right track, and I think that this other framework that I'm talking about actually falls out of that as well. And so I'm very keen on getting all of those aligned up, because I think that if you get that right, then the way that we speak to each other will become a lot more straightforward, and people actually understand how not only how they are similar and different to other people, but actually how the differences are meant to accentuate each other in order to collaborate into a greater whole, basically.
I'd be really, really happy to get this information because I've been doing a lot about trying to see the problem with the Big Five, just to put it briefly, is it's a descriptive theory, not an explanatory theory. People often invoke it improperly as an explanatory theory. It's properly a descriptive theory. Now, the amazing work that Colin DeYoung did with the cybernetic theory is he turned it into an explanatory theory and he grounded it in neuroscience and behavioral science. And then what Gary and I did was sort of extend that into embodied cognition and relevance realization theory. Colin is very pleased with this proposal. In fact, the three of us are working together right now to try and come up with some experimental design to directly test the proposal. And so trying to understand the relationship between personality traits and the kinds of knowing, I sort of kick myself in the head for not thinking to do that. It's very good, Struan. That's very good.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said to you way back when, the 4 Ps of worth dying for, or to die for, I think, sorry. And that was why, because I see the overlap. It feels to me like they fit together. So anyway, thank you very much, John, and I will be watching for the developments between you and Colin and Gary very, very closely.
Thank you. I mean, Colin is a former student and TA of mine, and Gary's a former student of mine. And it's, again, I mean this complimentary, no condescending. It's like watching your children grow up and come to fruition, and in many ways surpass me. Gary's first author on both of these papers. I mean, I play a significant role, but he's taking the lead, and it's terribly encouraging and gratifying. I don't know what to say without making it sound selfish, but it's just wonderful. And so I really want to honor all of my former students that are doing this kind of work.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Audrey.
Next, we have a question from Mem. And I'll just make a quick note, John. I've emailed you that information from earlier on about the Dr. Ben Goetzel. Just the
Thank you.
Actual question
Thank you,
was
Andre.
asked, so that's in your inbox, so now you've got it. So, Mem asks, a movement practice that might be similar to the dialectic into dialogos verbal practice, one that is not have the sparring or fighting aspects that a martial art would have?
Yeah, and I don't know of any pure movement practice. There's something like it, which is there's a kind of improv thing you can do with Tai Chi Chuan, where you're doing that. And then you can integrate that with a non-combative thing called circling. It's funny, it's got the same word as Guy Senstock's practice, where you physically circle with each other and you read each other and you pick up on each other and you improv in it. And it's very much like jazz with movement. And it very much takes you from the sort of egocentric, idiosyncratic movement patterns of yourself and those of the other person, and then you co-create inter-movement patterns with each other. So look up Tai Chi Chuan circling, circling within Tai Chi Chuan, which isn't quite push hands. It's often taught as a preliminary practice before you do push hands, which is a proper form of sparring. Although there's a kind of push hands that's in between circling and sparring, there is circling. And like I said, I find it amusing that it has the same name as guys practice. But look it up and you can watch videos and you can see how people are doing this and you can create patterns and you can shift and move. And it's very much a movement practice in which you get a wee space opening up between two people.
All right, thank you. Mark, you have a question for John.
Mark!
Hey, John. Yeah, I think that was Ben Sanford you and Struan were talking about there with the medicine wheel and that.
Oh, right. Yes. Thank you for that.
Yeah, like Ben. Yeah, he did a wonderful Q&A here for us a while back. It was great to hear from him. He's really interesting character.
Yeah, I've done a couple with him, and I've now that you've said his name, I can use it. I've told Ben that if he reaches out to me again, I'd be happy to do another one with him. I really enjoyed the last two.
Yeah. Well, it's sorry to hear about your hip. This is awful. You got to get better, not get better and then get worse. We got to get you on a better track here.
Well, like I was pushing myself too hard. So I was doing a lot of plank work, like from yoga, before I was going into my Tai Chi Chuan. And I just did a side plank and I took it too far and I wrenched my hip. It's getting better and it'll get better. So, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing.
Yeah, yoga betrays people. I knew it all along. With Eastern practices. I got some. So I was talking to Tito, who's one of the original meditation, live stream guys, and he mentioned really interesting. He said, the difference between mythos and logos in ancient Greece, that those are their ideas of 2 types of knowing. And that I was like, oh yeah, I didn't even think about that aspect, and it sort of occurred to me that, well, that's interesting because Paul van der Klee, who I think left, unfortunately, he's been talking a lot about 2 types of knowing instead of 4.
Yes.
You did. I don't remember you going through the Greek model and how it relates to say the 4 Ps per se, and also I wanted to get your thoughts on Kant's original project, right? This idea that philosophy hasn't been as successful as science, and so we need to make philosophy more successful. Oh, and by the way, philosophy is the handmaiden of religion, so we need to do away with that. And and then the idea of critique seems like the same idea as the postmodern critique. But and I maybe that's 2 separate questions, but that's sort of what I want to get your thoughts on.
They're very much related together. One reading of people, especially of Derrida, is rediscovery of the mythos within logos. So that's why he has the critique of logocentrism. And I would argue, well, as I keep saying, we shouldn't treat the postmodernists as if they're a homogenous group. We also shouldn't treat them as if they have 1 or 2 claims. The latter Foucault and the latter Derrida are very, very important. Even the earlier Foucault and earlier Derrida. I don't know as much about the others, especially Lacan and Lyotard, but definitely those 2 I've read in depth. I've come to appreciate, even though I have criticisms. What I was going to say is difference, is very much discovering the mythos within the logos. It's that part of meaning making that can't be captured by logical propositional relations. It's always making us defer and differ. I would argue, and I've made this argument, and I've made it in front of professional academics, and so it's not. I'm not saying it's been proven, but what I'm saying, it's been put at least to peer review, is that Derrida is basically talking within the continental tradition of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about relevance realization, and how that can't be captured propositionally or syntactically or in images or representations, that it's presupposed by all of them. And that's why I think Derrida becomes very, very interested in negative theology, towards the end of his career. Derrida actually talks a lot about religion, and although he's critical, he keeps coming back to it. There's very deep attraction to the Neoplatonic tradition within Derrida. It's funny how you keep seeing this in a lot of philosophers. Similarly, within the existential tradition, Camus, the great philosopher of absurdity, he writes his dissertation on Neoplatonism, deeply attracted to all of this. And so, the place where you see these two things being sort of set against each other clearly is in Plato, and that's the connection. Because I think Derrida, one of the things I would criticize Derrida is his reading of Plato as the elevation of logos at the expense of mythos. That's Derrida's central critique. I think it's just dead wrong, and that's said with respect. I have a lot of respect for Derrida. I think everything that's come out of what's called the third wave interpretation of Plato is that mythos, the drama, metaphor, the parables, the myths are doing as much work within Plato's philosophy as the arguments, the reason. And that dialogos, and many people are arguing this now, the dialectic into dialogos depends on a proper attuning relationship between mythos and logos. And I, of course, think this is very important. I talk extensively about mythos, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, as the ways in which we try to activate and celebrate and accentuate our relevance realization machinery by making use of exaptive processes that we often express metaphorically and symbolically. And Plato, because Plato is committed to a fundamental process of development, self-transcendence, he's doing something I would argue analogous, something that would at least, I think he would like to be understood, if he could use the language today, as something like a process of exaptation, self-transcendence, the kind of things I've been talking about. And of course, this comes out, as I keep making the case, when we try to deal with aspirational processes, transformational processes. The mythos and the logos are woven together in what Agnes Callard calls epileptic rationality. We have to have this relationship, this non-logical identity to our divine double, our sacred second self, and this is just integral. And it was understood in the Hellenistic period. Internalizing Socrates within Stoicism is not just what CBT has made it to be, which is just paying attention to your inferential processing and your inner dialogue and cleaning it up. No, there's a lot of work there about internalizing Socrates. There's a lot that's properly what we were talking about earlier. It's learning how to improv dramatically in a situation the way Socrates would, etc. It's about that serious play. So I think there's a lot that's going on in mythos and logos. I do think postmodernists, like at least Derrida and Foucault, are right in seeing that Descartes tried, I think it goes to Descartes and Kant just brings it to fruition, tried to separate logos completely from mythos. I think this is impossible. To my mind, this is equivalent to what's going on in AI, what had been going on in AI, of trying to separate computation, dynamical self-organizing processes like relevance realization. I think that's ultimately a fruitless endeavor. And I think that's one of the main claims of 4E cognitive science. This is a very long way of saying, Mark, I think that mythos and logos are interpenetrating, and the postmodernists are right to note that we've separated them and we shouldn't. I think they're wrong to attribute that separation to Plato. I think the best scholarship that's been happening in the last 30 years says that no, Plato is very, very concerned about finding the proper attuning relationship between mythos and logos.
Oh, that's good. So I mean, I guess like again, for them, that's two different types of knowing. And then the thing that I noticed, and I know nothing, I refuse to read these crazy philosophers like Kant, but something I saw as a result of a video that Paul van der Klee did, this guy summarized Kant, basically, Hans Georg Müller. And,
the wandering, yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff, although I kind of rip him apart quite a bit because he's very sloppy sometimes. But he says explicitly that Kant was the one that came up with this, not critiquing the thing directly, but critiquing the abstract, or critiquing the relationship, right? And that would cause all of these other problems. Like when you're not asking yourself why you believe in God, for example, but whether you should, like that changes a bunch of relationships, right? And so the intimate relationship between the things, the nature of that changes, and your perspective on it changes, and then that causes a bunch of shifts, some of which may or may not be valid, right? But if there aren't two types of knowing, or if you can't collapse the four types, the four P's into two, then are the Greeks incorrect? Or I very much agree with you can't do the logos without the mythos, right? Because you need a frame. But that would state that Kant is wrong, and that you can't separate religion as primary.
And Kant writes the book Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, which basically sets up deism. And then deism basically is the step that's going to lead to the death of God. So I think you're prescient about that. I think that's exactly right. I mean, the case. I mean, this is not my language. This is the language that many people use, like Highland and Gonzalez and people talking about Plato. Plato is on about getting the propositional to sort of fall apart in the right way so that we can see the importance of the non-propositional, because wisdom has a lot more to do with insight and transformation that is non-propositional in nature. Plato thinks that non-propositional is somewhat like techne, it's somewhat like a skill, it's somewhat like noesis, it's somewhat like perspectives, and it's somewhat like gnosis. It's somewhat like participatory knowing. And Plato uses all of those to try and talk about the non-propositional. Plato thinks that the way in which we play with those, with the non-propositional, is mythos. That's what I tried to argue too. And I try to make clear that that argument is ultimately dependent on Plato. I don't think of myself as the originator of that argument. I think of that argument coming properly from Plato. But one of my, I think we're wasting a lot of time criticizing the postmodernists for things that they shouldn't be criticized for. Where what we should be doing is acknowledging where their arguments are good so that we can then criticize them where they should be criticized, just like you and I are doing right here, right now. I think the reading, and the person I blame for this isn't actually the postmodernist, but the grand postmodernist, somebody who I usually think very highly of, but this is Heidegger. I think Vervaeke, in his book, right, Heidegger's Platonism, shows that when Heidegger shifts from seeing Plato as the exemplar of the cultivation of wisdom and philosophy to making Plato the enemy, and this gets picked up by postmodernism. Plato becomes the enemy thereafter. I think Heidegger makes a deep mistake here, and Vervaeke makes a very convincing case that mistake was bound up with his mistake of becoming a Nazi. And when you read some of the letters at that time, why he makes this transition, a lot of those reasons are not properly philosophical reasons. Reasons of more about him being able to say something original or new, in contrast to Plato. And so, again, I want to remind everybody, deeply indebted to Heidegger, deeply profoundly influential on me. There's a lot of 40 cognitive science that is deeply in debt to Heidegger. But I think Heidegger's relationship to Plato is an area in which he should be very properly criticized. And other people are doing this right now. There's books being published, like Vervaeke's and others, on just this point. And this is a place where postmodernism should be especially open to counter-critique, because their misappropriation of the very tradition that they're criticizing, I think, should be called into account.
Okay, yeah, that kind of validates a lot of the stuff I kind of noticed when I went into Carefree Wanderings series there, which is very interesting. I mean, the stuff when he gets stuff right, it's really helpful. When he critiques some of the stuff that he critiques, it's sort of crazy in my opinion. But thank you, John. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for also allowing me to riff on it and go beyond that. Because the carefree wandering is, I I've similarly found I'm ambivalent towards his work. I think some of the stuff he said, where he's invoking the is-ought distinction in a kind of unquestioning manner, given the work that's been done undermining the analytic synthetic distinction and the is-ought distinction as being something clear-cut and easy to point to. There's things like that where I find him um, sort of terrifically out of sync with what's happening right now in the discipline, to be fair to me, that he's claiming to represent. His big thing is that he represents sort of cutting edge philosophy, academic philosophy, in contrast to sort of popular versions of philosophy that are on the net. He's often right, by the way. A lot of the people he criticizes just are really improperly or poorly philosophically educated, and they're speaking stuff that is often misrepresenting the philosophers or the philosophy that they're speaking about. But I don't think he's as cutting edge as he thinks he might be. Of course, saying that makes me ridiculously self-promotional, and other people will properly criticize me for doing that, I hope. Anyways, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I agree. Yeah, when he gets stuff right, it's really good. Like they say, oh, there's a good summary of Kant in his first little video in that playlist there, and that was really helpful. I was like, oh, I know a whole bunch of things make sense. So, but yeah, I think some of his criticisms, I think he's deliberately saying Peterson a lot to get cred with that. Although I don't think that's going to go well for him ultimately, because I'm not sure his critiques are as valid as he'd like to claim they are. But yeah, I can see that a lot of his thought is a little backdated and sort of not up to snuff. So it's good to hear you say that, because it validates what my impression was, and that helps me make sense of where he's at. So thank you.
Welcome, Mark. I just need to say I need to get going soon.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been fantastic, and as always, and your answers are great and in depth, and we really appreciate your time here. It's so great having you here. So thank you so much.
Great questions. They're really, really good, and the community is so great, and everybody said good things. I was really impressed by what Struan was doing there. It's like I'm kicking myself in the head for not thinking about what's the connection between the four kinds of knowing, personality theory. That's really good. That's really good. I'll have to give Struan credit for that going forward. Anyway, I'd like to thank everybody, and thank you, Brett, and thank you, Andre. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, thanks.
It's always a pleasure having you.
And thanks, and have a great night. Thanks everyone for being here.